Alright, we are back with a new video, and today we'll be updating the Big Brother Canada 10 power rankings after week 6, ranking these players based on how likely it is that they'll win the game from this point. And this was a bit of an interesting week with one of the biggest players going home, and then having a pretty straightforward HOH, but then some interesting veto results happening, which could make things a bit more interesting. But we're going to be ranking these players based on how likely it is that they'll win the game from this point. But without further ado, let's get right into the list. So starting off at number 10, we have the latest boot from the season and the first member of the jury. We have Herman. And it's not too surprising Herman goes out here, as he was ultimately backdoored and the plan was to target him. However, I do admire his work in trying to get Gino and JC Lynn on his side. He is initially able to get them on his side, and even Summer on his side as well. But as time went on, like, they were slowly able to get back onto the Kevin side of things. They ultimately chose to evict Herman due to him being a big threat. And like I said, I feel like Herman is definitely one of the better players from this season, and definitely someone who was trying to play the game in a similar way to what we've seen in recent seasons of Big Brother US, like with the Cookout and with Derek from BB16, Cody from BB22, Paul from BB19, where he basically tried to build this big power structure in which he was the center of it and try to play the game that way. And while that game is usually effective on Big Brother US, on a season like Big Brother Canada, where a lot of these players aren't very good, in my personal opinion, and they really want to play the game, and through some interesting comp results, he was ultimately put into a pretty bad position where multiple times he tried to build a power structure that really worked for him. And we saw that through his first HOH, which was the first HOH of the season. He did some good work there, but then Kyle came along and blew it up. And while he definitely did some decent work in trying to rebuild, it just kept getting undermined over and over again until he was ultimately on the bottom and picked off. So it's not too surprising he went out here. It seems like Kevin is gaining more influence in the house over him that allowed him to be sent out the door. It's just a shame that he was unable to enact a strategy on a season like this. But I still do think he's a better player than what his game's demonstrated here. But it's the fact that he wasn't able to gain control that caused him to be the boot here. So because of that, he's here at number 10. And with that, we are now moving to the 9 players still in the game. And as usual, we'll be ranking them based on how likely it is that they'll win the game from this point. But at number 9, it is actually the same person I had at the bottom last week. It is Betty. Now, I will give Betty some credit for surviving the block this past week, but even then, like, it's not that impressive. I mean, especially over a big threat like Herman. Obviously, people are going to vote to save her. And I do think with Marty kind of blowing up his game by making her seem like the bad guy in the whole double eviction thing, I think that does provide her some cover. And really, at this point, with her having survived the block multiple times now, and with her having campaigned multiple times as if she was going to be on the block, I think she's probably going to be in it for the long haul. However, even then, as I've talked about before, I can't really see a jury awarding her the win at the end of the day, even if she gets to the end. However, I do think she is in a relatively decent position at this point and could make a deep run, but it's just the lack of win equity from a jury perspective that leaves her here at number 9. Now we're moving on to number 8, and we have the person who I think is the most likely to be evicted this week, and here we have Moose. Now the thing about Moose is he wasn't actually supposed to be targeted this week, as Gino wins HOH, and he puts Moose along with Summer up as pawns in an effort to backdoor Marty. And that was the plan going into the veto. However, Helena ends up winning the veto and is one of the few people that does not want to use the veto, like, as she doesn't really want to see Marty to go out at this point. And obviously through that pretty much leaves both Moose and Summer up on the block. And I think between them, Moose is more likely to go home, as I feel like the Kevin side of the house is incentivized to try to take out Moose. I think that's where they're leaning as well. So obviously through that, Moose is in a very tough spot at this point, and I think it's going to be very hard for him to try to flip the vote on Summer, assuming the veto is not used. Now, if Helena does end up changing her mind over the next day or so, which, again, given the track record of these power rankings, isn't out of the realm of possibility. If that were to happen and Marty were to get backdoored, I think Marty would go out over him. But assuming the nominations remain the same, I think Moose is in a lot of danger. And even if he does survive this week, I still think he's going to be a big threat moving forward. I've said that in previous weeks, and I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up going out here. So because of that, I have Moose here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we have the outgoing HOH, as well as the initial target coming into this week. We have Marty. And as I said, Marty was the intended target going to this week where Gino wanted to backdoor him. And with the track record this season being that the veto has been used, it makes sense why Gino would want to use the backdoor for his target. However, Marty gets very lucky with Helena winning the veto, as Helena is one of the few people that would not use the veto, like in order to prevent him from going home. And I do think that is a lucky break for him. I think Marty will probably stay this week with Helena not using the veto. However, even though he was the intended target for this week, I still feel like he will be a target moving forward. I think some people do want to take him out still. And even the people that want to take him deeper into the game, they recognize that he is less likely to win a jury vote at this point, as he really blew up a lot of his win equity through his HOH, particularly with his whole accusations of Josh and Betty manipulating him to, like vote for Gino during the double eviction, him not owning up to that vote, him trying to act as if he's doing what Canada wants. Like, all of that is really bad, in my opinion. And I feel like that's really going to harm his perception, even if he does get to the end. But it's just a matter of if he can even get there. And it's really put him in a bad spot. I mean, the fact that he was supposed to be the target this week is pretty bad. I wouldn't be surprised if people would still want to target him moving forward. But it's a really bad spot for Marty at this point. And while he is probably going to stay this week, it's still not looking great for him long term. So because of that, I have him here at number 7. Now we're moving on to number 6, and we have the other person who is on the block right now. And here we have Summer. And again, it's not looking great for Summer right now. Now, as I did talk about with Moose, I think she will probably stay over Moose if those are the noms, as it seems like people are generally leaning towards voting out Moose. However, it's not impossible for her to go out this week. I think there's definitely an opportunity for the vote to flip against her. And even beyond that, I mean, we see her not being in that great of a position at this point. I mean, technically her mom going out should have been good for her game, as her mom was definitely someone who was not as willing to work with her. And we saw her at one point consider to keep her mom, but then ultimately vote to evict him, which I think was the correct choice, as her mom really didn't like her not wanting to win competitions. However, it's not looking great for her right now. I mean, she's not in as great of a position as I feel like she was before. I feel like Kevin is kind of starting to run away with the game a bit, along with Josh. However, it's not impossible for someone to recover, but it's not looking great right now. So that, coupled with her being on the block and it technically being possible for her to go out this week, I have her here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and we have a bit of an interesting person to talk about, as it seems more likely that this person will actually make the end game at this point, as they've really ingratiated themselves with a lot of the people running the game right now. However, there's also a chance that she could end up on the block in the distant future, but here we have JC Lynn. And JC Lynn's an interesting person to talk about, as it seems like now with Moose being a likely target, obviously there's that. There's also Marty, who is a big target ahead of them. There's that. But a lot of people have been talking about targeting the showmance recently, that being between her and Gino. And that's been an issue for a while. And while there are still targets in the house that would be willing to do that, I feel like they really want to take care of the bigger targets first before going after the showmance. And in previous weeks, I assumed that JC Lynn would be the one who would ultimately go home, as I feel like Gino is more likely to win the veto than her. And I feel like through that puts her in a pretty precarious spot. However, I feel like as time has gone on, I feel like she has been doing some good work. I mean, she has sort of built a final 3 deal with Kevin and Helena that seems like it has a shot of working out. I feel like that's something that can definitely propel her towards the end game. And through that, I feel like there is now a chance that she could stay over Gino if the showmans were to be targeted. I find that somewhat impressive, though I'm not entirely clear what her win equity would be in that situation. However, I do still have her relatively low, as, again, it's not entirely clear what her win equity would be even if she gets to the end. Plus the fact that the showmans could still be targeted in the near future. She could see the block at some point. And while I don't think she would go home over Gino, it's not a guarantee per se. So because of that, I feel like 5 is about as high as I can put her. Now moving on to number 4, and we have someone who I mentioned not too long ago. It is the current HOH, actually. It is Gino. And Gino has not played this HOH particularly well, in my opinion. Obviously not to the extent as the Marty's second HOH or even Kyle's HOH as well. However, I still think he went into it with the wrong approach, where he obviously came into the week wanting to backdoor Marty, and through that he put up Moose and Summer as pawns, and obviously he did that in the hopes that the veto would be used, as it had been used in every week of the season so far, and ultimately backdoor Marty as a result. However, I don't think backdooring Marty is necessarily the correct move for him, as Marty is a pretty big target to have ahead of him. And considering people have been talking about going after the showmans for a while now, getting out Marty this round would be a pretty bad move, as it would definitely elevate the target level of the showmans, making it more likely that he's going to be targeted moving forward. However, I do think there is still a chance they could be targeted in the near future. And as I just talked about with JC Lynn, I used to think that it was a guarantee that Gino would stay over JC Lynn. As one, I think it's more likely that Gino would win the veto if him and JC Lynn were put up on the block together. But also, even if they were still on the block together, I feel like he would have more social connections to where people would want to keep him around, despite not being that active of a player at the end of the day. And I think that's part of the reason that I have him above JC Lynn even now, is that even though he should be in a much worse position, I feel like he's just a likable enough person to where he's not in immediate danger per se. However, I still worry about him quite a bit. I don't think he did the right target going to the HOH. And even now, like with the veto not being used, when Moose possibly going home as a result, I don't think that's particularly great for him either, as again, Moose is another potential target to have in front of the showmans. And it's still, again, even if the showmans were to be targeted, I still think there's a chance he could win the veto anyway. However, it's no longer a guarantee that he would survive a vote over JC Lynn, in my opinion. And that's a big reason I dropped him a bit from his previous standing. However, I still have some confidence in him, even if he's no longer included in a lot of the endgame plans by the people running the game at this point. So because of that, I'm here at number 4. Now we're moving on to number 3, and we have the 3 people who I think are pretty likely to get towards the end of the game. And while they're not technically in a final 3 deal together, I think they are probably going to be in it for quite a bit longer. But at number 3, we have the person I think is probably the least likely to win a jury vote of these 3, but here we have Helena, the winner of this week's veto comp, actually her first competition win of the season. And as I alluded to earlier, she does not want to use the veto this week, as she wants to keep Marty around for another week. She's relatively close to Marty, but also recognizes that keeping Marty in the game is necessary for having a target ahead of them. And again, I feel good about Helena at this point. I mean, she has a final 3 deal with Kevin and seems to be in a decent position to make it towards the end game. However, I feel like of the top 3 people, and really of a lot of people in this cast, like it's hard to see her winning a jury vote right now. And while I think she could step it up still, if I'm being perfectly honest, I think she could technically step it up to try to win more comps, maybe get more involved in the strategy, and then win a jury vote that way, particularly if she cuts Kevin at the final 3 and takes JC Lynn. I think that's a winnable scenario for her. However, it's still not looking great for her jury chances wise. I think there are other bigger jury threats than her, if my personal opinion, based on the current position of the game. So because of that, I had to leave her here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and these are the top 2 players of the season, or at least the top 2 players left in the game at this point. But at number 2, we have Josh. And this is technically a big jump for him, although even then, it's not that big of a jump. I mean, the main reason I had him relatively low last week was because he was still on the block at the time. The veto is unlikely to be used on him. However, the veto was used on him since then in order to backdoor Herman. And I think it's somewhat impressive that the veto was able to be used on him to an extent. It's incredible that Kevin was able to convince Marty to, be on the plan to backdoor Herman in the case that the veto was used. And again, I feel like through that, Josh is now in a pretty good position. Now, as I alluded to earlier, he is not in the final 3 plan with Kevin and Helena, as I feel like they probably still are going to try to target Josh at some point. However, I feel like Josh has been playing more actively as of late. I feel like he has connections that he could use to try to get towards the end of the game. So I don't think it's a guarantee that he'll be cut towards the end of the game, but that will be an obstacle for him. And I feel like that is enough to leave him here at number 2. Although, to be fair, I think he probably has a better shot of winning a jury vote than the number 1 person. But it's just the prospect of him not being in the end game that leaves him here at number 2. And now at number 1, it is the same number 1 as last week. We have Kevin. Now, again, I don't think Kevin is a guarantee to win, even if he gets to the end, as I think there are definitely bigger jury threats out there than him. And I can see people not really seeing his game as much as we see it from home. However, he's still playing a relatively impressive game where he was able to convince Marty in the last week to get the insurance that he would indeed backdoor Herman if the veto was used on Josh. And sure enough, he got that. And through that, he was able to take Josh off the block, get Herman his biggest target on the block, and send home as a result. And now he should be in a relatively good position. And obviously, this was a pretty good week for him as well, where Helena is able to win the veto and make sure that Marty is not backdoored. Marty, of course, being a relatively big target to have ahead of him. And I think that's good for Kevin's game. I mean, Kevin himself did not want to use the veto as well. He wants to keep Marty in the house in order to keep not only himself safe, but also the showman safe, as that is now pretty integral to his power structure. And again, I feel like that's a pretty good spot for him to be in. I feel like this was a relatively good week for him in the whole. And because of that, I still have him here at number one. And there we go. That will do it for this week's power ranking. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. And moving forward, I'm still going to be covering Big Brother Canada moving forward. Stay tuned for that. Survivor 42 is in full swing. I will also be covering that. Later this week, I'll be coming out with a player ranking for Australian Survivor now that that season's wrapped up. And now that things are starting to clear up a bit, I am considering doing some other types of videos, more general Survivor videos moving forward. I'm not sure when they'll come out exactly, but stay tuned for that. But for now, that is the video. See ya.